All right, welcome to Political Science 370, Social Science Research Methods. I'm Dr. Carl Doerfler, and today we will be discussing an article chosen by Aleziia Medina called Voting Power, Policy Representation, and Disparities in Voting's Rewards, by John D. Griffin and Brian Newman, and it appeared in the Journal of Politics. There's that, if you want to take a look at that and look up the article. This, incidentally, was an outstanding article, I think, and Ms. Medina did an outstanding job reviewing it. So, Michael, since you're the only person here in class under quarantine and my son, who do members of Congress usually respond to more when voting? Voters or non-voters?
Voters. Voters?
What makes you say that?
Because they're the ones that vote for them.
Well, exactly. So, do members of Congress want to get reelected?
Yep.
Yes. And so, if you want to get reelected, does it make more sense to give voters or non-voters what they want?
Voters.
Voters, exactly. So, in this article, the authors kind of expand on the literature that has looked at whether members of Congress respond to voters or non-voters more. And it's pretty well established that members of Congress respond to voters more than non-voters, right? But as their article is titled Voting Power, Policy Representation, and Disparities in Voting's Rewards, they're going to expand more on whether you're just a voter or non-voter more. And they're going to develop this idea of voting power and how it affects policy representation. Okay, so their model basically is going to look like this. Okay, Michael, take a look at this. It's always hard to get on here. So what is the dependent variable? What's on my y-axis?
Policy representation.
Policy representation, exactly. And voting power is going to be their independent variable that they're interested in the most, that they're focusing on the most. But then there are going to be other independent variables that they take a look at. Race, African American, Latino, gender, whether you have consistent policy preferences, and whether you're co-partisan, meaning you don't always vote for the same party, or whether you go back and forth between the parties. Okay, so let's start with the dependent variable, policy representation, and how that is measured. Michael, if you were trying to measure policy representation, how would you do that?
Oh, I have no idea.
Exactly. It's hard. It's really, it's tricky, right? But the idea is you have to come up with some way of measuring what a person wants and then whether a member of Congress votes for that person on that issue, for what that person wants, right? So, would you as a college student want free college tuition?
Sure.
Sure, why not? And then, so if a member of Congress voted for free college tuition, would your policy preferences be represented? Exactly. Okay, so that's basically how they go about measuring policy representation. So, stop me when this gets too technical, Michael, because you're going to have to represent the whole class here. This is from the article. To measure policy representation, we compare constituents' policy preferences as measured by the 2004 National Annenberg Election Study, rolling cross-section, to roll call votes cast by their members of the U.S. House of Representatives in the 109th Congress, 2005 to 2006. So the NAES, that's the survey that went out to people, right? The NAES provides us a sample of almost 37,000 respondents. So is that a lot of respondents?
Yes.
Yes, that's a huge sample size. Meeting our need for a measure of preferences on a number of specific policies, some of which came to a vote in the 109th Congress. Right. Now, Congressional Quarterly identified 24 key votes for the 109th Congress, 9 of which occurred in domains for which the NAES included a sufficiently comparable item. Right? So, in other words, like the free college tuition question that I asked you, right? The survey had to have asked a question similar to that in the survey that went out to 37,000 people. And then a vote had to come up on that topic in the 109th Congress, 2005-2006, right? So for each constituent and each vote, we scored whether their member of Congress voted as the constituent would prefer. So they had to pair, this is an enormous data set, right? And they had to pair an individual's policy preference with how the member of Congress voted on that one. So you better be good with large data sets and have good graduate students working on this, right? So if the member of Congress voted as the constituent preferred on a particular vote, we coded the constituent a winner won on that vote.
Okay.
If the member of Congress voted against the constituent's preference, we coded the constituent a loser 0 on that vote. If the member of Congress voted against... Okay, so, does that make sense? All right. Then they do a couple tricky things to it. They establish this win ratio. But at the end of the day, that's what they're going off, are these 9 survey questions, and then how the member of Congress voted on a comparable policy issue. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So, now, that's your main concept. You know, this policy representation and also voting power. These are the 2 main concepts. So, policy representation is your dependent variable, and that's basically how it's measured. It gets a little more technical than that, but that's basically how it's measured. Does that sound like a good measure of policy representation to you? Mm-hmm. Yeah, close enough. Mm-hmm. You say in a survey you want this, and then the researchers find how members of Congress voted on a comparable issue, and the number of times they voted the way you said you would prefer, the higher the score, right, on 9 items. Okay, now voting power, as I said, gets a little more nuanced than just voters versus non-voters, right? They come up with this idea of voting power, and they say those who are likely to vote are not strongly predisposed to vote for one of the parties. So in other words, your vote's up for grabs, in a way, as a citizen, You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
This is talking about citizens. Those who are likely to vote, they're not strongly predisposed to vote for one of the parties, and are members of large groups within a particular constituency. So you're with the majority in a legislator's district, right? Okay. So it makes sense how they measured voting power?
Yeah.
Okay. So they include a number of tables, which I'm not going to show you because I don't want to overwhelm you. The main couple of tables are table 1 and table 2. So let's take a look at table 1. Hey, we can see that okay. Can you see that okay, Michael?
Yes.
Okay, so it's titled Voting Power and Policy Representation. Remember I told you every table should be able to stand on its own?
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's a little, whatever. It's fine. I'd label it all just policy representation. But anyway, policy representation is your dependent variable. Don't worry about this conflict districts over here. Don't worry about this column. Let's just focus on this one for right now. Voting power. So, as voting power increases, what happens to policy representation?
Increases.
Increases. Is this statistically significant?
Yeah.
Yes. Really strongly, or it's close?
Really strongly.
Really strongly. How many times the standard error is the coefficient estimate? Just eyeballing it.
Oh, I get like 20.
Yeah, many times.
I'm making that a lot.
A lot, exactly. And so it comes back really statistically significant. Like, we are really sure that voting power has an effect on policy representation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, now let's look at our racial categories. African American, Latino. Again, what is the omitted category?
White.
White or everybody else, right?
Yeah.
So white or all other races.
Mm-hmm.
That's your reference category. So compared to Caucasians, what effect does being African American have on policy representation?
Decreases it.
Decreases policy representation, absolutely. According to the model here, what effect does being Latino have on policy representation?
Negative.
Negative, reduces policy representation, exactly. What effect does being female compared to male have on policy representation?
Negative.
Negative. Now, interestingly enough, they thought household income and whether you voted in 2000 would be statistically significant. They weren't. But they're saying maybe that's because that's being picked up in voting power. It's being mediated by voting power. We talked about multicollinearity a little bit. Yeah. So maybe that's voting power is capturing those two. Next, if you have consistent preferences, what effect does that have on policy representation?
Positive. Increases.
Increases policy representation, exactly. And you're co-partisan. You don't consistently vote for one party or the other.
Oh, positive. Yeah.
Increases policy representation, absolutely. N 36,000. Is that large or a small sample size? Large. And I don't want to get too critical yet. But look at the R squared.
Yeah, it's a
0.06.
That's really bad.
Exactly. Like I said, we don't want to be R squared snobs, but how well are they predicting their dependent variable, the model overall?
No, you're explaining like 6% of the variation.
Yep, they're only explaining about 6% of the variation in policy representation. So in other words, their model is not doing very well overall at predicting policy representation. But that's not really the contribution this article seeks to make. What is their most important variable out of all of these?
Voting power.
Voting power, exactly, right? And so they're trying to illustrate, and I think they do a good job of it, of showing that voting power has a strong positive effect on policy representation, right? Now this second column, conflict districts, as it says, this denotes districts with conflict between high and low voting power constituencies, standard errors in parentheses, just like always. And voting power matters there as well in the conflict districts, as does consistent preferences and co-partisan. But look at the R-square on that conflict districts one.
Yeah, it's really bad too.
It's really bad too. Yeah, now keep in mind they have a smaller sample size. And so you're going to lose some explanatory power there.
Yeah.
But still, that's a really low R-squared. It is. I don't mean to be an R-squared snob, but that's low.
Yeah.
So especially in those conflict districts, they're not doing a very good job of predicting policy representation, right? So what affects congruence between a person and how their legislator votes? A lot of things that aren't in these models, right?
Yeah.
Which, I don't know, it's interesting. Otherwise, the way they operationalized policy representation, I thought was very good. The way they operationalized voting power, I thought was very good. Those are like you say, those are really bad R-squares.
Yeah.
Okay, now, then they come up with this kind of more nuanced model a little later that's very similar. My understanding is policy representation is still the dependent variable. But in this one, they get a little more complex. Voting power, as we can see, what's the effect of voting power on policy representation?
Positive.
Positive. Statistically significant?
Yes.
Yes. What's the effect of being African American on policy representation?
Negative.
Negative. Decreases policy representation. What's the effect of being Latino on policy representation?
Negative.
Negative. Lowers policy representation. What's the effect of being female?
Negative.
Negative. Lowers policy representation. Now we have middle income and high income. So what is the omitted category?
Low income.
Low income, exactly. So, what's the effect of being from middle income and high income groups on policy representation?
Positive.
What are you talking? No, you're gone down to the interaction terms.
Oh.
Go back higher. Go right under female.
Okay.
Right under female.
My bad. Statistically insignificant.
Statistically insignificant. Thank you, son. You're really worrying me there.
The wrong thing.
Yeah, I know. You were going too far down. You were going down the interaction terms. Don't do that.
Okay. Don't kill
Okay.
Sorry.
So, middle income and high income compared to low income groups, no effect on policy representation. Voted in 2000. That lowers policy representation. That's weird. I'd have to read that more closely, figure out why that is. Middle income interacted with voted in a particular year. Interaction term here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So compared to someone who's low income and voted, what's the effect of being middle income and voted?
Positive.
Positive. High income and voted?
Positive.
Positive. Co-partisan?
Positive.
Positive. And consistent preferences?
Positive.
Positive. Now let's take a look at the R-squared there. How's the R-squared there in the first model?
Horrid.
Or yeah. Then we can go down the conflict districts. Second one here. Same thing. Coefficient estimate up top. Standard errors in parentheses. Voting power. What effect does voting power have on policy representation?
Oh, it's are we looking at? Sorry, I was looking at the first one. Are we looking at the second one?
Yeah, look at the second conflict
okay, yes,
districts.
Positive.
Yes, exactly. Is it close, or are we really sure that there's a statistically significant relationship between voting power and policy representation?
We're really sure it's statistics.
Really sure. How many times the standard error is the coefficient estimate?
A lot.
Yeah, many. When it reaches that point, you don't even need to give me a concrete answer. I'm just looking for many. Way more than 2. Mm-hmm. Right? So are we really sure that this coefficient estimate is different from 0?
Yeah. No, one question I had looking at the first one, am I missing something? Or middle income isn't twice the standard error, but they're not having it as statistically significant. Middle income.
Middle income?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not. It must have just missed it.
Huh.
Yeah.
Weird.
Like I say, in general, when it's about double the standard error.
Okay.
But yeah, and they may have, I don't know, they may have just missed it. But yeah, in general, it needs to be double the standard error. Go down in the conflict districts. Middle income lowers policy representation. Then the interaction terms again. Go down the interaction terms. Being middle income and voted increases policy representation. Being high income and voted increases policy representation. Being co-partisan increases policy representation, and having consistent preferences increases policy representation. And the R squared in both models? Bad. Low. Well, they're low.
Yeah.
They're really low. They're just really low. So, my overall kind of, well, let me ask you first. Overall, what do you think of the article?
It's good.
It's good?
Yeah.
Okay. Very technical. Do you think it makes a valid contribution to the representation literature in political science?
So.
Absolutely, I do as well. And that's important. You know, keep in mind when, this is the opportunity for us to just talk, right, about methods, is when we look at papers like this and you try and assess, was that a good paper? Was that a bad paper? Why was it good, right? Mm-hmm. It's good because I think it number one, makes a contribution to the representation literature, right? Yeah. Quite frankly, some questions are more important than others, right?
Yeah.
In a democracy, is it extremely important to know when members of Congress will vote, how their constituents want them to vote?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like what we expect in a democracy, right? Yeah. And so, like I say, some questions are more important than others, and this is one of the fundamental questions in political science. What affects how a member of Congress votes, and do they respond to citizen preferences, and which citizens do they respond to? Voters, certain racial groups, certain genders. You got to look at those types of things, right? Okay, now, again, there's a lot in this paper that makes a good contribution. One of the things I want to make sure people understand is, just because we're into the representation literature, the argument is made that one of the reasons why African Americans don't have much voting power is that in our two-party system, the way it's currently structured, Democrats don't have to compete for their vote.
Oh.
You know, it's if you're an African American in 2016 and you didn't like Hillary, what are you gonna do? Vote for Trump?
No.
You know, I mean,
what percentage of African Americans voted for Obama?
It was crazy high. It was like 98 or 99% or something like that. It was really high. And I think like 90% voted for Gore in 2000. You know, I mean, you get it is really high. And so that's one of the concerns in the representation literature is if one of the parties feels like they can almost take your vote for granted, then they have no incentive to really go to bat for you.
Interesting.
To fight for you. Yeah. So there it is. So next thing on this, a couple things I wanted to point out, and these are kind of technical, but it's kind of fun to look at these as they come up. So they're talking about how they measure policy representation, right? Mm-hmm. Citizens have preferences, and then members of Congress respond to citizen preferences. Okay. Well, is it also possible that members of Congress influence citizen preferences?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're public figures.
Right. They're elites. They're public figures. Absolutely. Especially when individuals' opinions aren't necessarily fully formed. Right?
Yeah.
You know, so, like, my views on abortion are pretty stable. Right? But my views on some other topics may not be as fully formed, right?
Yeah.
So some scholars have argued that particularly on issues where your opinions aren't fully formed yet, elites may actually be influencing the masses rather than the masses influencing elites, right? And so if elites are actually influencing the masses, then what do we have?
An endogeneity
problem. Exactly. And so in the footnotes here, this is on page 54 if anyone wants to look up the article and read this. Hurley and Hill argue that members of Congress, their behavior and constituency preference can have reciprocal effects on issues that clearly divide the parties. On such issues, members of Congress MC behavior can affect constituency preferences, especially for co-partisans. We limit the possibility for reciprocation in 3 ways. So they're addressing the endogeneity problem.
That's good.
Yeah, well, exactly, right? So they acknowledge there could be reciprocal effects here, right? And so I thought this was really nice. So they say we address this, okay? First, we measured preferences, citizen preferences, in that survey, 37,000 people. First, we measured preferences before the roll call votes in question. So citizen preferences first, then roll call, right? So time order, which is critical, right, in this situation. Therefore, these roll call votes cannot influence preferences, right? Because they measure the preferences first.
Yeah.
Second, we included several issues that cut across party lines at the time of the roll call vote. For example, stem cell research and immigration, votes on which at least a third of Republicans broke ranks, and therefore should not exhibit reciprocal effects. Third, MC, meaning member of Congress, MC behavior affects co-partisans most, so we include a control for co-partisanship, which will soak up most of the effects of any reciprocation. So the point is, there was a potential endogeneity problem, and they addressed it, and that's how they addressed it, which was pretty good.
Yeah.
You know, the best, which I thought was most straightforward, was they measured citizen preferences first, and then the roll call votes occurred later. So the roll call votes could not have influenced the citizen preferences.
Interesting.
So you couldn't have an endogeneity problem, but they directly addressed it. Pretty nice, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty good. All right. Next thing I wanted to say about this article. And this is mostly for the political scientists in the class. Sorry for everybody else. But the research cited Morris Fiorina, V.O. Key, and Richard Fenno quite a bit. Those are like three of the biggest names in political science, right?
Yeah.
Which lets you know they're addressing a very important question. Representation, you know,
Yeah.
Who gets represented, who do members of Congress respond to, and that's why they can tie their work into the work of three of the biggest names in the discipline, right? Which you need to understand. I mean, you need to understand the arguments that these earlier researchers made and the contribution this article is making. It's really valuable. On a very personal kind of fun note, the article also mentions Kim Hill, Jan Lakely, and Patricia Hurley. They're cited several times. They also did a lot of representation research, and I took classes from Kim Hill and and Patricia Hurley, and I worked for Jan Lakely and Kim Hill at AJPS when it was at Texas A&M, and they were the co-editors. So,
Wow.
Yeah, so it kind of becomes a small world, and it's interesting to see the contributions some people make. So that is it for today. Hope you guys are enjoying the videos, and take care.